idea, understanding and transcending race. Carlos opens the talk with a short introduction to the origins of the idea and meaning of race. He talks about geographers prior to the 17th century only divided people according to countries and regions. A pivotal turning point was in the late 1600s with the publication of a new division of the earth by Francois Bernier, which first promoted what Carlos describes as the lethal delusions of human difference. Bernier's work is widely considered the first published post-classical classification of humans into distinct races.
I always say to people, I wish somebody had said to him at that time, "Are you crazy, Francois? You can't just divide people like that. That doesn't make any sense." Now, we can grant that folks back in that time didn't have the science we have now, but it doesn't mean that everybody thought it was a good idea. He did, and enough people with power did, and here we are. So, what led Bernier to think that way? And I won't read all of this, but you can have these slides, afterwards if you'd like, and I can make them available to you. A wonderful psychologist named Hirschfeld, his name is here, does a lot of great work with children in their development. And he talks about race and having studied children around race. And what makes race so compelling to the human brain is not that there are races, but that we are very prone to categorize, right? And race fits very well with our susceptibility to put things in rough and dirty and quick categories. And as he says here in the bottom, virtually all humans are born with susceptibilities to contract smallpox and other diseases, but it doesn't mean we have to get them. And if we are careful, we can guard against them. And if we get them, we can treat them and sometimes walk away from them. So race I sometimes refer to as a virus of the mind, in this day of the coronavirus. We are susceptible to thinking that way. And when it's reinforced the way it has been and is constantly in society, in many societies, it feels as if it's something that's inevitable, but it's not. Another wonderful author, Audrey Smedley, who was actually my reader for my dissertation, has written some wonderful books on race. And she talks about the racial worldview, by which she says, it's simply believing and acting in accordance with a social convention that people can and should be regarded as members of one or more of a handful of nebulous, restrictive, contradictory, and conflicting subspecies called race. Now, after reading all those qualifiers, one might wonder who would subscribe to that racial worldview? And the fact is, too many of us do. And I often say to folks, how has that been working for us? And I never mean to, minimize the historic struggles, and the sacrifices that have been made in the name of civil rights in our country and in other places around the world. But intellectually and in terms of actual efficacy, it is a serious question that I ask. How has the racial worldview been working for us? And I suggest not so well. And the reason for that is that the noble, fight for racial equality is, in my view, an oxymoron, because the notion of race itself is fundamentally predicated on inequality. To be a member of a race is to be better than or worse than another race. It's just baked into the idea of race. So there can't be racial equality. There can either be race and inequality based on race, or there can be no race. Now we know from science, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm sure our audience knows this, and if not, we can come back and talk about it later. We know from science, we know from genetics that there's no such thing as race. There's no gene for race. There's nothing about any human being that you could look at in their body and say, this is why this person is, you name it, Black, white, et cetera, et cetera. There are subpopulations within the human family, and I think that's important to acknowledge. But most of those have to do with geography and ancestry, right? Which is why we can see certain diseases cluster, within people who come from certain places. Sometimes that overlaps so much with the way they look that we think it's because of the way they look, because of their so-called race, that they will get sickle cell anemia or something like that. But that's not actually the case. So that article you just read, or I just quoted from, was written by these folks who are all, at least optically, folks of color. I do some work with the University of California at San Francisco in their science department. And when I'm out there, I often say to them, What do you do about race when you're not in your lab coats? You know, do you actually live a life that says there's no such thing as race? Or do you go back out and actually act as if there is race? And I push them, you know, the scientists and anybody else on this call, you know, if only those of us who know best what an absurdity the concept of race is would help the rest of us detach from our practice of racialization, the world would be a better place. But sadly, what happens, you know, for most of us, despite knowing, you know, that we should take race out of human genetics, and you'll see this article was written in 2016, and there is more and more just explicit confirmatory science about this. Race doesn't belong in science. I wrote a piece on this myself, that if race doesn't belong in science, it doesn't belong in our beliefs either. So the word memetics here has to do with memes, which is a word that Richard Dawkins coined maybe back in the 70s. And it simply means an idea in the mind that gets so powerful that it becomes like truth. And race is a very powerful meme for us. We know there's no gene for race, and I suggest that we'd do better without the meme for race as well, without the belief. Another sort of confirmation or statement of this from Nature Biotechnology, volume 23 in 2005. Proponents who like to use race as a placeholder in science or for other things, as a crude marker of variation that might as well be used until better markers come along, right, are making a mistake, because race is a meaningless marker of anything. And this is one of my favorite lines from any writing about race. Pooling people in race silos is akin to zoologists grouping raccoons, tigers, and okapis on the basis that they are all stripy. We would not say that these animals belong to the stripy race, right? We would feel silly by saying that, because it is such a superficial and small aspect of what these beasts and animals are. And yet that's what we do with race, you know, based on something as thin, you know, as skin deep as skin color, we say that people like Anaya and I, you know, are the same race. So that's where race came from. That's what we're still stuck in. You know, there are a lot of wonderful sort of books about that you can read, and I'm happy to refer to you to some when this is over. What does it mean to challenge the idea of race? You know, to quote unquote transcend race. And to give you a sense of at least how I think about it, I'll take you back to some work I did that led to this book that I wrote. This book was a function of my dissertation study of racial identity and some thinking and sort of arguments about race and how we should think about it. The two people on the cover, you might recognize this one from a few years ago. This one you won't know. And sometimes I have people just play a nice guessing game about who this person is, but I'll cut right to the chase. This is my son, Evan. He must have been, oh, I don't know, 8, 10 years old there. I always say to people, he is not adopted. I made Evan with the help of his mom, of course. He's now about 27 years old, and we took this picture somewhere on a beach in Costa Rica. I actually, with children, will make this part of a presentation I do on critical thinking around appearances. And when this one comes up, I invite, you know, the children to actually say, you know, what's alike about these two people? What's different? What's the relationship to each other? And it leads to some wonderful mind expanding thinking about what is race if these two people can be related. Before I move on, I'll just pause to say that the title of this book, you know, was The Arc of a Bad Idea. And I emphasize the arc, you know, that the idea of race is shaking, loosening over time. It's not where I think it should be. And I try to be careful about that because I don't want to push the river on it. I'd like us to move as quickly as possible. But as I said when we began, I want us to sort of respect and have empathy for why people are still so attached to this idea. So when I say transcend, which was not my word originally, it actually came from a researcher before me who I'll give some credit to in a moment. It's not about escaping and being gone forever from this thing we call race. It's more about getting above it and then coming back down and living with race differently than we did before we got a better view of what it's all about. So when I talk about transcend, I hope you'll think in terms of transcending and then returning, right, with a better view. This is a quote from one of the Apollo astronauts that talks about this in a very physical way. I really believe that if the political leaders of the world could see their planet from a distance of 10,000 miles, their outlook could be fundamentally changed. Borders would disappear, little differences wouldn't seem as big, and it ends with, the earth must become as it appears, blue and white, not capitalist or communist, blue and white, not rich or poor, blue and white, not envious or envied. And this is a common experience, of astronauts and folks who get to be far enough above the Earth to see that some of the physical boundaries that we kill and die over are kind of silly. This one from Edgar Mitchell. You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck, drag him 250,000 miles out and say, look at that, you son of a bitch, and hopefully see it differently. More relevant to our journey, is a wonderful quote from someone named Rainer Spencer, who's done some wonderful writing on race transcendence. And one of Rainer's quotes that is lovely to me is, my journey has taken me past constructions of race, past constructions of mixed race, and into an understanding of human differences that does not include race as a meaningful category. I don't know how many folks who are on with us right now find that resonant, but this is a perfect capture, of the way I feel about race. I ended up doing a study of folks who actually, do transcend race and can give us a sense of what it's like to move beyond it. I don't know if any of you know what this is. I'll explain it in just a moment. This was the very sort of clunky, nerdy, academic-y title of my dissertation. I won't take you deep into that, I won't bore you. But my question was, who are these people who achieve this? So that thing you saw earlier, this is sort of a cleaned up version of it. And it's actually a scale that was used to classify people by race. So it was actually a device, the scientist or the doctor would ask you to hold up your arm. They'd place the device here because they thought that you wouldn't be so tan there. So maybe this is your quote unquote real color. And then they would match you, according to the shade that you are. And I wonder, can any of you, who are viewing this find your race here? And is that how you want to identify or be identified? Part of the reason that I put the picture of my son and I on the cover of my book is that I want it to be very upfront, and I will be upfront with you now. This is an academic, professional, certainly endeavor for me, but it's also very personal. There are a few things more personal than the study of race and how we act on it. So for these two people, like, what race are they? And who gets to decide? And what if they don't want to be a race at all? In America, at least, when race was being forged here, but still, at least socially and culturally to this day, we're under the sway of the one drop rule. So Evan, despite looking the way he looks, would be qualified as Black, right? It's completely absurd. I am not actually from this country. I was born in Costa Rica. My folks hail from Jamaica and South America. I have a grandfather whose skin complexion is more like Evan's and like mine. Who gets to say what we are? And what if we don't want to be any of it? Don't want any part of it? So for my study, I actually solicited folks who are Black, and I'll use that term now, even though I tend to say racialized Black, by their own designation, and have at least one parent who is also identified as or identified by people as being Black or Black racialized. One of the first responses I got was from a young person who talked about, I'll go back just one, being so happy that the study was coming, because she said she grew up as a person who was of many different heritages, was constantly asked, what are you, what are you, what are you? Until finally, and I'll just read the end of what she wrote. Finally, one day I realized, why does it have to be one or the other? What if my choice was that I'm going to be too big to put in a box? I decided there and then that I was a-racial, sort of like agender, a term that some of you might know. I didn't identify with any race, and that was my identity. I'm so glad to have found a group of people that feel the same way. I've never felt more at peace with myself now that my identity is in my own hands. And I think that's the power of expanding this discourse, around race as most people view it, and, maybe transcending it as well. So this research began with my talking to a wonderful woman named Carrie Ann Rockamore, who herself identified as biracial, and she was very interested in the destinations that folks who are biracial end up at. What she found in her study is that a lot of folks, 60% of them, said that they are exclusively biracial, neither Black nor white. So if you called one of these people Black, they would say, no, I'm neither, right? I'm biracial. About 20% of the folks in her study qualified themselves as either Black or white, one or the other. So if you ask them, are you biracial? They would say, no, I'm Black or I'm white. Our former president, Barack Obama, is someone who sort of falls in this category. He is technically biracial because he has a Black identified dad and a white identified mom, but he self-identifies as singularly Black. And then she found some folks, about 6%, who just could go either way. This is a quote from one of her subjects. He said, well, shit, it depends on what day it is and where I'm going. I'll choose what I want to be depending on the circumstance. And then Carrie Ann was surprised. She didn't expect to find any other than these three categories, but she found a fourth category. She found some people that she called transcendent. About 14% of her folks said, I don't want to be any of those things. I'm just human. Like, don't put me in a box. And as an honest researcher, she didn't just say that they are in the margin, I won't even talk about them. She recognized them. And that's how she and I ended up talking and how I ended up doing my research. What does it mean to be transcendent? You know, and this is from her work, I want to give her credit here. It means consciously denying having any racial identity whatsoever, because there is no such thing. It means not using race as a construct to understand the social world or their relative place in it, similar to Rainer Spencer's quote from earlier. It doesn't mean that folks who have brown skin wish to be quote unquote white. They're not bitter about being quote unquote Black. They simply disavow race as part of their sense of self, period. Think of, by way of analogy, someone who grew up in a religious family, right? And maybe there are generations of this family that's been Catholic. But for this particular person, religion is just not a relevant thing. It doesn't mean they want to be a different religion. It doesn't mean they're bitter about their family's Catholicism. It means religion just doesn't register for them. It means, or it doesn't mean the typical colorblind ideology. You know, the race transgenders that I talked with don't think that everybody should just see everybody as human and forget about their skin color. They know that racialization matters and that racism matters. And it was very likely, and it was true for the folks I talked to, that they were discriminated based on how they were racialized. So transcendence is not, you know, sort of a rose-colored glasses looking at the world. It's more an intellectual understanding that this thing, race, is very problematic. And for some people, so much so that they disavow it. So the question for me was, how'd you get that way? Like, in a society like America, if you look like me, how is it that you could transcend race? Particularly since the dominant discourse is that it's assumed that in a society where racial membership is emphasized, as it is in America, the development of a racial identity will occur in some form for everyone. So this is written by someone named Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's huge here and is a major authority on racial identity. And this book that she wrote just keeps coming. It keeps getting reprinted. And she really touts the reasons why folks who are racialized, particularly racialized Black, sort of stick together and why it's important to honor that identity. But I emphasize here, it's an assumption. It's not a fact, you know, that if you grow up in this kind of society, you're going to end up with a racial identity. I certainly didn't. And nowhere in racial identity theory is there room for people who feel pretty good about who they are. They have no desire to be white. They have no desire to be Black. And they have no desire to be racialized in any manner whatsoever. They realize that they are, you know, as they move through the world, but they don't attach to it. And that's what it means to sort of transgress. So what does it entail for a person to refuse to accept his or her racial designation? The folks in my study provided some good information about this too, because I asked them, and they produced some narratives about what I call transgressing or transcending race. So these were the categories of questions in a sort of a loosely guided discussion I had with them. I wanted to know their early history. I wanted to know how they were assigned to race and their own self-definition. I wanted to know how they looked and how that played into their sense of racial identity, if at all, what the ramifications were of them transgressing or transcending race, why they think and how they think about race transcendence, and then just a reflection on the whole thing. And I had some wonderful conversations with about 10 people in all. These I'll give you a chance to just look at. This is a capture of some of the information that they filled in for me when I asked them for some just overall information on themselves in the category of why they're interested, what their sex is, et cetera, et cetera. The folks I ended up talking with were very interested and almost liberated by having a chance to talk about this, because there isn't really permission to talk about this in this country. And as you can see, and I don't know, I did not have a large N, a large subject population here, but a lot of these folks were pretty well educated. I don't know if that's a correlation of thinking this way. I'd love to do a larger study to see that. Here's someone who identified as African American, Caucasian, Korean, and really wanted to sort of explore this whole idea in the study. I had a lovely person who actually lives in South Africa who became part of the study. Embraces differences of other people because there's only one race, the human race. And then a lovely man that I spoke to from California who started off as a very, very devout, he called himself a Black nationalist. And then he really talked about his journey from that to being a race transcender. So seeing the possibility of that kind of movement, was and still is, very inspiring to me. In the end, instead of the assumption that because there is racialization in society, everybody's going to have a racial identity, my studies sort of showed that, yeah, for some folks, if you buy into the notion, yep, you racialize yourself, you adopt the views that are racially normative, and you end up with the ramifications of that. But for some people, they have a dystonic, reaction to the idea of being racialized, and that leads to resisting it and sometimes transcending it. And then some aspects of race they might adapt, maybe they're multicultural or mixed, and then there are ramifications for that. But for some folks, there was a complete abnegation, which just means like refusing it entirely. Like, don't do the race thing with me, I don't want to be part of that. And that's a much different look at race than what is the dominant discourse in our country and in most countries, sadly. And finally, the one I'll spend time on before we open it up, how can we destabilize the ideology and belief system of race? And I would offer that it can be very helpful to know a few facts about why people think the way they do about race. Anne Morning, wonderful researcher and writer, did a study with scientists, asking them or trying to find out how they think about race, because one might think, that scientists, as we were talking about earlier, would be the group that knows better. But she writes, constructivism and anti-essentialism have hardly conquered the academy. Even in my highly particular sample, where anthropologists made up half of the interviewees. In contrast, the essentialist proposition that races are biologically grounded entities remains a compelling view for many contemporary scientists. So by interviewing these folks, she was able to discern that they still think and treat race as if it's biologically grounded, despite knowing better academically. Coming back to our silly, sort of logic then that we can just group people on superficial bases, how and why does that happen? Part of it, and I was talking about this with Anaya before we began, is that the social journey, at least here in America, of discrimination has led people to need to and want to bond around the thing that oppressed them, right? If they're going to see us a certain way and treat us a certain way, to the fact that they're going to take our lives over it, we probably should bond around that. There's a reclaiming of an identity. Soon there's solidarity. And what started off as a species, categorization of race becomes almost like an ethnic group, that these folks have such a solid bond around resistance and solidarity and taking care of each other. So again, I think it's crucial to honor why this is the way it is right now. You'll see this if you ever read my book. There's a chart here. I promise I'm not going to read this through. This is a much simpler version. But this is my attempt to actually explain the process by which we create race. And here's the simpler version. Racialization, it's the technology of race, is how we make it. And I have fun talking with children about this. I know you'll get this very quickly too. There are just a few steps to creating races. One is selecting some human characteristics that are signs of racial difference, and it could be anything. Right now we're speaking in terms of the black-white binary. It could be your height, it could be your nose shape, it could be your eyebrow thickness, like you name it, could be anything. In this country, it turned out to be skin color and lineage. Once we've done that, we sort. Dark people over here, light people over here. After that, we start to load up, those designations, those differences with attributes. It seems to me that those dark-skinned people, blank, blank, blank. Seems to me those other people, those light-skinned people, boom, boom, boom. And suddenly we have some differences, based on anecdote, prejudice, stereotype, etc. And then the biggest thing, about race is that we essentialize the characteristics. Unlike your tribe, your religion, your politics, your nationality even. You can become a citizen, of a different country. Race, you can't change. We say it's baked into your bone and it's hereditary and you're locked into it. Why? Because that served the slaveholders very well to say that you can't skip out of this after a generation. You're still my slave. And then finally, we act on that, right? And that's the process of racialization. And my advocacy is always that we start talking about race in terms of racialization, not in terms of the false construct. And if we can interrupt this process, if we can destabilize this, I think we're on our way to better days. When I'm working with people, sometimes I ask them to make a race. I'll say, you do it now. Just come up with a category. I once offered airplane passengers as a category because I had just finished a flight to go and talk somewhere. So seating status became the differentiator, right? And if you're like me, when you walk into an airplane, you pass all those people in first class who are really comfortable. They're already being served. Maybe they're watching a movie, drinking a glass of wine. They just seem wonderful. And then you're trudging your way to the back of the plane to find your seat. And I wrote down, it seems to me that those people are calmer, more confident, better looking, and just plain more appealing than the folks who sit in the economy place, the econers. And then the essentialization. It's not just that these people in first class have more money. There's a reason why they have more money. There must be something deeper, right? Something genetic about them that has set them up to do better in life, so much so that they get to ride first class. I don't happen to be one of those people, but I sure would prefer to be one of them. And that's the process of racialization. It is that simple. I was saying to Anaya earlier, the focus of our discussion here is obviously about, race as practice in America. But racialization simply means relegating a group of people to a certain status and then treating them that way. It could be based on religion, nationality, you name it. As we move towards the end of the framing, in terms of destabilizing, if you go to philosophy, the discussion about race becomes metaphysical, and one author does a very nice job sort of laying out some possible ways of dealing with the problem of race. And he writes, we might favor retaining racial categories, just keep them the way they are, and maybe that's the best we can do. Or we might seek to transform those categories without removing them entirely. So let's revise it. This is sort of, all right, let's keep race, but let's try to achieve racial equality, right? Or we might try to eliminate it. And he calls those three choices retentionism, revisionism, or eliminativism. And you might be thinking to yourself that you sort of move towards one of those or another. I will tell you that I think there's a fourth category we should think about. Retaining, revising, eliminating. One, I don't think we should retain it. I think that's a problem. I don't think we can revise it because you can't achieve racial equality, as I talked about earlier. And sadly, I don't think we can eliminate it because it is like a mind virus that's going to keep coming around. So the best we can do is sort of resist it in a way. And I call that correctivism. We should take every chance we can to just try to correct that thinking, because it's just a bad mind habit. And that might mean, or would mean, committing to counteracting the custom of racialization through self-discipline, education, advocacy, counter-narrative, and hopefully, at least in this country, there was an anti-smoking campaign, we'd get to the point where most people can resist this thing that they've come to know is bad for them. So my choice is to be correctivist. One of the ways we might correct the discourse right now is to expand the meaning and actually correct the meaning of what racism really is. Another one of my favorite quotes, racism resembles a gun. While mean racists use it to coerce or kill, kind racists help keep it loaded by supporting the underlying racial concepts. Right, I'm gonna walk this through in a moment, but I want you to get this meaning here. It's saying that to be racist is not just to think ill, of people because of their race. It's to believe that there's race in the first place. Because without the basis, there isn't anything on top of it. I often say that our discourse about race is built on a false bottom. We sort of tacitly accept that there's race, and then we try to fight racism. But we need to get under the floor and realize there's nothing there. There's nothing holding up the whole discourse. One way to think about it is your life or the world as the room of racialization, right? And if you are in the room, you might be a kind racist, pretty close to the door, almost out. You're almost non-racist, right? If you're outside here, or you might be a mean racist, somebody who's really to the back, Ku Klux Klan, at least in this country, someone who's a white supremacist, no bones about it. So where you are in this room depends on who you are, maybe a time in your life, you move around in here, front to back, you change, but you are still responsible for racializing people. You will not become non-racist until you step out of racialization altogether. And I invite, the folks who are with us tonight to think, are you in the room or are you out? And if you are right now thinking of me as a member of a race, or Anaya, or anybody else that you can see on the screen because I can't see you all, you're in the room, right? I don't suggest that you're a mean racist doing terrible things to people, but simply by upholding the idea, you're part of the problem is what I would say, with great respect and love. What this comes down to for a lot of folks who find it hard to give up the idea is cognitive dissonance. And Fanon had a wonderful definition of this. When we hold a core belief that's very strong, and then we're presented with evidence that works against that belief, it's hard for us, right? It's hard for us to square what we hold as true with something that says, no, maybe that's not the case. And this is what I encounter all the time when I talk about race transcendence and expanding the discourse. So again, I want to honor that, but that shouldn't be a reason to hold on to a bad idea, right? Sadly, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. And I often say to people, we've been fooled, about race. If we can just see that and move on, it would be great. I see no reason why I should be consciously wrong today because I was unconsciously wrong yesterday. I often say to folks, it's perfectly okay to not have known something, but it's not okay not to grow once you do know something. So when confronted with the truth about race, how do we grow? And finally, this is something I wrote at the end of my book. The effect of race transcendent perspective is not to deny the psychological or sociopolitical truth and power of race, but to be empowered actually to disengage from the hegemonic and seemingly inescapable racial worldview, gain the liberating insight that the detachment affords, and then re-engage with the idea of race in a new and enlightened, and I hope liberating way. So back to all the questions where we began. I walked us through the first four. I hope some of that was at least generative of questions and conversation that we want to have. And I leave the last three to simply be part of the mix. So I will stop talking at you now and encourage and welcome your conversation. Anaya, any place you'd like to start? Oh, and if folks want to go back to a certain slide, just tell me and I'll find it and we can talk about that.
Thank you. I mean, this is, very, very fascinating. And I hope that a lot of people have, seen them an alternative perspective to the conversation about race. And again, if anybody has any questions, please ask them. So I'm first and foremost going to start off with a few questions. So I guess, what would you say to somebody who says, well, I've experienced racism my whole life, and so race has been a defining feature of my life, regardless if I want to transcend it or not. So instead of necessarily transcending it, maybe I want to invert the meaning. So for example, we've seen it with like Black Power, Black is beautiful, people trying to, instead of necessarily abolishing race, accepting it's a reality, but trying to find new meanings and more positive meanings in order to kind of reconcile with the reality of race. What do you say to someone that argues that particular perspective?
Yeah, so I hope it might be useful to, and I do this a lot, to move from the very charged thing that we're talking about, which is real and serious, to an example that is parallel but less serious. So maybe we can just see the intellectual worth of it. So when I was younger, and I had some great friends, but we fought and we did all sorts of things and we would tease each other. And one of the nicknames or the teasers that would get to me is when they call me blockhead, because my head, I'm not sure you can see it now, but it's a little flat in the back. And that would make me mad enough to get into a fight, until, my folks finally told me, like, your head is not actually in the shape of a block, So I could become sort of proud of my blockhead. I could sort of reclaim the identity of being blockheaded. I could say blockhead power, et cetera, or I could say, this thing you're charging me of isn't true, right? I think, and it's very understandable, the sad mistake that gets made with pejorative identities is that the reflex is to reclaim them, right? So gay has become a very positive term here, as has queer, as has, at least for some folks who identify as women, the word bitch. All of that is a strategy to take something that is negative and then make it positive because it's been an identity imposed on one. That's one strategy. I suggest another strategy is to say that the thing you're ascribing to me isn't valid in the first place, right? So instead of someone charging, which is what was done, initially as these poor folks were dragged across the ocean and told that they were something, that they were, well, pretty ugly words, then Negro, then the reclamation started, Black, African American, etc., right? But the reclamation only works for the people who want to reclaim it. The folks on the other side who are still attached to the original derogation still see you that way, right? Gay for people who are anti-gay is not a positive thing. Queer for people who are anti-queer is not a positive thing. They haven't been won over, by the fact that these people have reclaimed it. That doesn't mean the reclamation is a bad thing. I don't mean to be saying that at all. I completely understand and actually honor, the fact that people put that effort into resisting oppression. What I'm suggesting is that there are different ways to resist oppression. And when oppression is rooted in illogic, I would suggest that's the place to start, right? I'm not equal to you because all races are equal. I'm equal to you because there are no races, right? The predicate is wrong in the first place, right? But we've started a little bit above that, and we need to go back to the root and pull it up, right? The predicate doesn't stand.
So then I guess the question is next is how do we talk about people's differences then? Because you say you don't want race to be a meaningful category, but the reality is, there are people that look different and we are visual beings. So how do we discuss that if not in the terms of race?
I would say, and for folks who are, with us tonight, this could be a live conversation because this is the first time I've actually had a chance to talk with Anaya. I would say, you probably hear this all the time from Americans, but I love your accent. Tell me where that comes from, right? And I would leave it that open. I would say, what's your heritage? I would love to know your story. Those are much different questions and much different frames and much different doors into learning about somebody than saying, wow, what is your race? What are you? Those questions immediately limit, right? Because I'm looking for the box that I want to fit you in, instead of asking you to tell me about you. And if I say, like, Anaya, tell me your story, you can start anywhere you want to. You might talk about your journalism, you might talk about your folks, you might talk about what you had for breakfast, you might talk about your race if that's the most important thing to you. But that's an invitation for you to talk about your identities, plural, and the things that mean something to you versus me doing a census with you, like which box can you tick off?
And also, would you say that in transcending race, you lose something? Because even if, race is not a meaningful category, for most people, they understand what we mean when we say Black culture or Black music. Does transcending race mean that you have to let go of those things as well?
That's a wonderful question. When I was a teenager, it was the time when race, being Black racialized, was really being reclaimed. It was a very heady time. I received scholarships because they were attempts made to try to level the playing field a little bit. I wore a big, loud, and proud afro. I had my pick there, and I watched Soul Train, which was a dance show that featured racialized Black artists and dancing here. And I really took pride in all of that. That culture still means a lot to me. I just have removed it from any roots in science, right? It is more ethnic. It's more something that was fashioned by people that did some wonderful overcoming of adversity. So that's real in terms of what it is. And I consider myself to be a cultural straddler. I consider myself free to indulge in and honor any culture that I want to. It doesn't mean I want to appropriate or say I'm something that somebody says I'm not, but I don't consider those boundaries, to be static and to be closed. I think they shouldn't be.
So I guess, what does it mean practically? So you talked about, how as individuals we can recognize it if we are racializing somebody and choose not to do that and be aware of that process of racialization that we are maybe putting on our children or putting on other people. But is there actual specific things that I mean, maybe in America, you know, that you could call for? I mean, earlier we were talking about the census. I think it'd be interesting to know for people that want to, I guess, forward this as an idea for wider society. How do we start to actually practically remove race from the fabric of society?
It's a great question, and I'll talk in terms of just two important areas, I think, of society, any society. One, pedagogy, you know, what do we teach? And then policy, and we can use the census as an example. I do a lot of work with young children, kids in what we call pre-K here, 4 years old all the way through 8th grade, but I've taught across the spectrum. And I just did a talk the other day with some teachers, and I basically said that in your teaching, whether it's history or science or talking about the literature that you're teaching on for English, if racial identity, you know, is part of the subject matter, and you proceed as if race is a viable biological thing, and unless you don't do that, you probably are supporting it because that's what your kids think, because that's what the world tells them, then you're in pedagogical malpractice, right? There's a wonderful book that was written here called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is about historical fallacies that just get sort of carried on through mythology and sort of national pride. And race is a lie that my teacher told me if we're not interrupting the bad thinking about what it is. So if in science, we're not teaching there's no biology of race, if in a novel that contains, you know, the history of slavery or whatever it might be, we're not stopping to say, and by the way, there was no biological basis for this, then we're not doing our job. If as parents, you know, we're teaching our white racialized child that, you know, there are Black racialized people too, and we need to treat them well, even though they're different from us, then we're not doing our job. Instead, we should be talking about shades of skin and melanin, you know, and saying that that's about as far as it goes. Everything else is something that happened in this society that's a terrible thing, you know, so don't fall for that. You know, that's a lie. Just as, you know, the myth that women are inferior to men is a lie. You know, we need to teach these things. In terms of policy, let's take the census. We know that the census was created to control people, right? To empower some and to keep some down. The original census in this country in 1790 had a category for white, you know, and enslaved people. And maybe if you were Native American, it sort of fluctuated for a little bit. And then things changed over time, and the census continues to change. I sometimes say that the US Census curates identity in our country. They get to decide what's on the wall, what's in the gallery, what you see, and what you have to fit yourself into. When talking about, you know, how the census might change to be a little less racialized, I suggest that we still need to keep track of how people are oppressed, discriminated against, mistreated because of their racialized status, but we could simply ask that. So instead of on the US Census, which I just filled out the other day, me being forced to, under penalty actually, it's not a severe penalty, but under penalty to tick off one of those categories, or several, I can tick off several if I want to, there should be a box that actually says, I prefer not to racialize myself. There should also, though, be a box that says, if you have experienced discrimination, oppression, mistreatment based on your racialized status, please say that. You know, and as a Black racialized male in the society, that happens to me. You know, and people should know that, and we should keep track of that, and we should funnel resources into education and law enforcement and whatever else is necessary to cut into that practice. But that practice isn't based on race, because to say that it's based on race suggests that there's something about me that causes that to happen. Particularly when I'm talking to young people, to Black and brown young people who have sort of gathered that by being who they are targets. I try to make very clear to them that it has nothing to do with you. You're a beautiful little person. What this has to do with is the infected mind of the person who perceives you a certain way and then thinks it's okay to act on that. You are just a person, right? And your personhood is beautiful. Race is not a thing, but there are people who think that race is a thing that they should act on in a certain way that makes you a target.
So I've seen a few questions in terms of, you know, I think you kind of touched upon it already, but somebody has asked, I'm wondering your views on the UN and their racial equality policies since the tragic death of George Floyd. I guess that kind of plays into the question, you know, how do we, and I think this is something that is an ongoing thing in my mind, how do we actually reconcile the struggle to transcend race with the reality of racism. Would you argue with what you've said in terms of education and things, that the way to combat racism is to continually argue that race is not a meaningful concept? Like how do we, and yeah, how does that reconcile between the struggle for racial equality? As you said before, you think you cannot have racial equality with race, and the logical question is then what do we do about racism and racial inequality?
To be really, I guess, simplified about it, hopefully not simplistic, two things. We recognize that the basis of racism, which is race, doesn't exist. And we then turn our attention to the process of racialization and the practice that keeps reproducing race. Because when people look at us, right now, they are doing the racialization process, right? They are noting a superficial marker that puts us in a category. They're sorting us from people who don't look like us. They are attributing to us, certain qualities, too many of them negative. They are saying it's essential to who we are, and then they're treating us a certain way, whether that's their reluctance to affiliate with us, or to hire us, or to educate us, or to let us into the store, or to follow us around the store when we're in there. All those things are about racialization. They're not about race. They're about somebody's belief in race, but we need to combat both of those things. And I say these days, and I hope it's possibly provocative and not just provocative, we'll never, overcome racism until we start resisting racialization, because racialization just keeps recapitulating the same thing over and over again.
So this is another question, and I think this is somewhat related to what we've been speaking about. So someone's asked, how can we translate your own individual refusal to accept others in position of racial categorization upon you on a personal level with a society that might impose these categorizations on Black people collectively? Don't we need a political rather than a personal strategy to defeat that? And I think, because you were saying earlier about, you're not really a fan of the notion of abolish race. And I guess, don't you think that that is, something that is really strong and, grabs people's attention and puts that kind of that on the political agenda? That's much stronger, kind of abolishing race and perhaps transcending race, which is a personal thing, whereas the concept of race and racism is much more a kind of political and societal phenomena. Do we need a more political response rather than just a personal one?
Well, I think for any serious social issue, we always need to move from the individual, the micro level, and even the meso level to the macro. Right? We know that race and racism is a historical, structural, institutional, systemic problem in this country, and individual efforts won't do it by themselves. So yes, at some point, and let's go back to the census, a government level intervention, would be required to start moving things along. In terms of abolishing, let's shift from race, again, to maybe help us to see how this parallels something else that we have a bit more movement on these days, and talk about gender. Right? There is no movement to abolish gender, right? But there is growing acceptance and recognition of that gender is more of a spectrum issue, including not being on the spectrum. Someone can refuse, to want to be identified as a gender. It doesn't mean that when they walk out on the street and walk out in the world, people aren't going to gender them. They will, because that's the social custom. But there is growing comfort, familiarity, room for, oh, I know Carlos, Carlos doesn't want to be gendered. Pronouns are whatever they might be, right? So because of a movement systemically, it filters back down to people being willing, more than they were before, to honor how I want to be identified. Can we get there with race? Of course we can. And in some ways we have. Again, going back to the census, when in, I think it was 1990, the census allowed people to mark more than one race. That was a movement. Right? And that was pushed by certain parties that were lobbying that didn't want to be just boxed into just one race. So even within something as governmental, institutional, structural, and I think flawed as the census, we see movement. And that happens with individuals, and then, meso level groups that sort of advocate for it. And then maybe there can be a movement.
We've got quite a few questions coming in, so I'm going to read a couple of them
Sure.
instead of reading one at a time. So one question is, how does the cultural history and traditions of Africa, Europe, Asia, etc. fit into transcending race? So are we arguing that we should focus on cultural and intellectual achievements rather than skin color? Another question is, do you agree the notion of race is in this intersubjective? It is not a physical reality, but the effects of what is in the intersubjective is very real. And another question is, to Carlos and everyone, for Britain, as it entered a new century, the opportunity to transcend race had never been better. Across previous decades, discriminatory barriers were removed and British social attitude surveys showed a steady decline in racial prejudice. In parallel, we witnessed a steep increase in so-called races living, loving and working together. My question is this: what is stopping the trans race balloon from rising? What needs throwing out of the basket?
Oh, that's a beautiful way to think about it. Going back to the cover of that book that I showed you, it's an art, right? I think it is rising. We could get rid of some more ballast, I guess. But I guess my energy around this is appreciation for any movement that there is. I wish it would be faster. I wish it could be instant, but it's not going to be. And that's all I meant when I said, abolish might be more of actually a provocation for resistance, than a lever for movement, because movement sometimes has to be gradual. In terms of some of these wonderful questions, so I'll go backwards. What needs to come out of the basket? I guess what I would put into the basket is, more helium, because I think some of the habits of mind and some of the cultural practices will be slow to change. But if there is a counterbalance to that, a lift, and maybe some of those practices won't be as weighty as they have been. And the more of us who are talking about this, again, not in a way that is needlessly combative, because we know what happens with human beings when they feel that they're being fought, they just fight back. But is dialogical, is open, is empathic, and invites just, this kind of conversation, then I think the basket will rise. In terms of the reality of anything that's intersubjective, absolutely. Like, perception is reality. If I believe something about you, whether or not it's true, whether or not you align yourself with my belief, I'm going to act on that belief until my mind gets changed. So yes, this is about intersubjectivity, right? Again, if I walk around the world identifying as a woman and someone attacks me, because they think I'm a man, that's like a terrible mistake, because I'm not this thing you think I am. But you treat me based on your perception of me, not on my perception of me. So yes, intersubjectivity is what this is all about, and making space to not make assumptions about people based on their anything, until you ask the question and get an answer to, tell me your story, tell me who you are. In terms of the cultural one, like, should we not, think about history and cultures in terms of skin color? Well, we can't not, sadly, because skin color and phenotypic presentation is a proxy for other things that do matter, where you come from, what your people did, and they become intertwined. So again, we ought not to be colorblind, because color has so much meaning in our world. It doesn't scientifically, it ought not to, but since it does, we can't just walk away from that social construct. When I'm sometimes talking about social constructs, I'll bring up money, and especially if I'm with kids, I'll take a dollar bill out of my pocket, and then I'll take a piece of paper, and I'll say, let's compare these things. Like, look at the dollar bill, what's on it, everybody knows what a dollar looks like, and here's a piece of paper. And I'll say, since we agree that there's both paper, I can just do this. And I rip the non-dollar bill in half, and then I rip the dollar bill in half. And there are audible gasps, and people are upset because I just tore up money. And I say, we know that money is a social construct, but just by knowing that doesn't mean we can get rid of it, right? It's too embedded, it's too intertwined in the way we live our lives to just walk away from it. But perhaps we can manage it better by putting some distance between our beliefs about it and the reality of it.
So I'm going to take a couple more questions before we close, because it's very much coming to an end now of this very, very fascinating and amazing conversation. Somebody has asked, in the early part of your lecture, Carlos, you talked about the term race being not in existence prior to the period of the international slave trade. Are you able to say more about the first appearances of this term in the lexicon? And is this a question that can be answered differently in different places? Is the language more or less prominent in different territories?
Yeah, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, and by that I mean my study. There's some folks who've done and do some much better work than I know of on this, or that I can sort of translate to you. But what I think we all know is that prior to the 1500s, right around the 1500s, race sort of meant different things. It could mean family, it could mean lineage, it could mean a group of things, perhaps even a breed of things, but it wasn't until the American sort of laboratory that race came to mean what it means now. It wasn't really essentialized before, America started to form. Before that, a race could actually mean the monarchy, the race of leaders, the race of kings, the race of whatever it might be. And there could be some permeability, around who's in that race and who isn't. But because America had a particular need, to keep enslaved folks in that caste, race became essentialized. So yes, prior to the 1500s, race not as big and bad and deep and sort of permanent as it is right now. And then with the American experiment, sadly, it became what it is now.
And so we're going to finish with one final question. And I think that this will kind of summarize, your final points and this whole discussion is, do we just flatly refuse to recognize race and continually reframe our position and challenge prevailing notions? And I think so, going forward from this conversation, when people, discuss racism, discuss race, is that how we should really start from that premise that race is not real. Race is not doesn't have the meaning that we essentially use in society, and we should essentially deconstruct it every time we interact with somebody talking about it or the discussion in wider society.
Well, I'm glad we're ending with that, because I would never want people to think Dr. Hoyt is writing a prescription to, I don't know, hit somebody as soon as they use the word race. That's not what I'm suggesting. I don't think that when somebody, particularly if they identify by race, they shouldn't be met with, hold on, that's not a thing. Don't say that. Instead, I hope that at least privately, one can start to be the anthropologist, the sociologist, the psychologist, and start to like see what's happening. How has this mind virus, I say, and that's a negative term, I know, but that is what happens to our brain. How has this idea taken hold in such a way that I'll use myself as an example? Carlos is proudly insistent that being a Black male is super important right now, and I want to stand for that, right? That shouldn't be taken away from me. That should be understood. That should be empathized with. And at the same time, how and when, might I be able to invite Carlos into a discussion about what does that really mean? Can we talk about that at some point? But if we just, and I don't care what the topic is, again, going back to cognitive dissonance, when we confront people with the opposite of something that matters to them, all we're going to get is resistance, right? So go easy, hold it lightly, think about it, find those people with whom you can have a good discussion, sharpen your skills, do some more reading, talk with me some more, that would be helpful. And the change not just will happen, it is happening. One of my favorite quotes is, the future is already here, it's just not evenly dispersed. I think it's William Gold, and I hope I don't have that wrong, because I like to give credit to folks who've come up with wonderful things. The point being that, as with the folks in my study, there are people who already think this way, right? Nothing is static across sort of the landscape of humanity. There are cutting edge things, and there are things that are in the backwater that are still the way they were. This is a thought that if folks here are listening and persuaded, you should have that thought, figure out what to do with it, but realize that not everybody you encounter is going to be in the same place.
Thank you so much. And yes, we have come to an end of this fascinating discussion about what does it mean to transcend race. And this will hopefully be part one, continuing to discuss imaginative and creative conversations about how we move beyond this myopic moment. So I just want to say thank you so much, Carlos, for speaking today. And, I'm very grateful for such an insightful and wide-ranging and fascinating discussion. So thank you. And thank you everybody for tuning in.